Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. We are almost back to our normal schedule after recouping from the fires. My whole family got very sick. It's been a disaster over the past few weeks. 2025 off to a pretty brutal start in the Morgan household, but I was able to record a couple of great interviews, which we are going to be releasing, and a bunch of others which are scheduled as well. So slowly we're getting back to our regularly scheduled program. Today's episode is actually going to be 3 clips, and these clips that you're going to listen to used to be paid episodes. So these were only available to paid subscribers. We released them a couple months ago, and so now you're going to get a chance to hear what some of the paid subscribers had a chance to get access to as well. And overall, these 3 episodes are going to focus on 3 things. One is mastering one skill at a time. The second is encouraging constructive disagreement. And the third is embracing self-management. And these are all very crucial aspects for leading in 2025. So the first clip that you're going to hear is from Diego Barreto. He's the CEO of a company called iFood. It's a Brazilian company. And he has this really interesting approach. I haven't heard it from any other executive, any other CEO, about how he learns things. He considers himself a lifelong learner. And I was really interested in, what does that mean? What strategies and practices do you put into place? How do you actually do it? And just the way that he breaks down his approach from reading to finding the right people to connect with. It's very structured. And I think it's a very interesting approach that a lot of leaders can implement inside of their organizations and even personally for them. So whether you're looking to learn about something like AI or crisis management or marketing or, some leadership technique or strategy, how to even make better decisions, this approach, I think, is going to be something that is pretty useful for you in your journey. So let's get right into this clip from Diego Barreto. Here we're going to talk about lifelong learning because it's very important and a lot of people talk about it, but very few people maybe do it. Everybody says they do it. So what does lifelong learning mean to you? And do you have any strategies for how you actually put it into practice to go beyond just words?
So, Jacob, we live in a world currently where knowledge is accessible, right? I come from the countryside of Brazil. I remember myself reading newspapers, and that's it. The printed newspapers that arrived at home, that's what I could get. Today, we live in a world where you can be in touch with the brain of the specialist of the topic you want to study. Doesn't matter which topic. So how did I discover you? By looking for the specialist that could help me to understand better aspects of the HR world. So what I'm trying to say is that lifelong learning today is hacking where these people are, how you access them, and how do you learn from them. It's not about being fixed on where you use it to get knowledge. So you're talking about how do I do that? So I will tell you. I decide every 6 months to choose one thing to learn. That's the first thing.
Okay.
And I start with a manual, like a very superficial book, and then I start to go down. The more I read, I get specialized. The more I know people that are specialized, because here and there they are quoted, they are mentioned, and so on and so forth. So the second stage after I learn for 6 months is to start to be in contact with these people. They are producing podcasts, they are writing newsletters, and so on and so forth. You, again, it's a great example of this. The third thing for me is to use X or Twitter. But what do I do there? I go there, I stop to follow everybody. I get the specialists that I want, and I start to follow only them. And then what the algorithm does to me, it delivers me more people that are specialists on these topics. So I spent 6 months doing this in one topic.
Okay.
And then next 6 months, I change topic. Of course, there is a few things that I keep doing because I'm interested, but that's how I do my lifelong learning.
Interesting. So let's walk through that a little bit more in detail. So you said you first start off with what, like an actual notebook that you put together?
Yep.
Okay, so in that, or like a blank piece of paper or whatever it is. Okay, and then so what
Yes.
do you
So
put? Okay, and you put the what you want to learn. So maybe I don't know what's an example. Like what would be an example of something in there?
I can give you an example. Like a few years ago, it was like artificial intelligence.
Okay.
So a few years ago, I said, okay, I want to learn this. So I said, what does it mean? So what will be the impact on my life or my company? Okay, so I more or less know what I know, and now I know what I have to be better. And then I start to look for books, like very like superficial books, where I learn the basics, and then I start to go to more specific books to learn more.
Hmm. So, but if you do one topic every 6 months, somebody might say, well, that it's why not do like 10 topics every 6 months? For example, right now, like I love to read as well, and I'm reading a lot of very different books about different topics. It's not like one area and I narrow down, but there's so many topics as a CEO, right? Artificial intelligence is one, globalization could be another one. You could think about, HR, you could think about geopolitics, you could think about organizational structures. Like there's so many topics out there. So if you pick one that you really focus on every 6 months, how can you possibly get to all the different topics that are out there? Like, have you
Yeah,
found that to be a challenge?
yeah. No, I have two things to tell you. Uh, I like to be focused. I believe in the power of focus.
Okay.
So what I do is spend out of my time that I read, maybe 70, 60% doing what I just mentioned to you. The remaining, I read many different things. But what does it mean? It means that I'm a generalist in this second bucket here.
Okay.
And okay, I mean, being a generalist is good, but it's just good. It's never great because if you don't know the specifics, you really cannot add the most valuable contribution that you can do. The second thing that I wanna tell you, Jacob, is uh, I really think that while people try to catch up with everything, they really don't get the best on one thing. And you may
Hmm.
say, okay, Diego, but as a CEO, you should be very good in many things. No, no,
Yeah.
no, no. That's why I have a great team. That's why I have great people together. That's why I can call somebody and say, I'm taking this decision or I'm trying to learn this, but I'm not a specialist. Can you help me? That's what I call collaboration. I don't need to be a Superman, right? So I prefer to spend time building this
Yeah.
and collaborating instead of trying to do everything in a very superficial way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it seems like maybe a lot of leaders do the opposite, where they try to do a lot of different things. They don't spend enough time building a good team and collaborating, and then they kind of drown in all the information. I remember I've shared this story in the podcast a few times. It was Laurent Therivel. He's the CEO of a company called US Cellular. And I had
Uh-huh.
him on the podcast a little while ago, and he said, in any given year, I should only be making 10 decisions. That's it. And he said so many times a leader feels like they have to be in every meeting, every phone call, every decision, and they make hundreds, thousands of decisions every year. He's like, I don't do any of that. I only go to meetings where I know I can add value, and I only want to make 10 big decisions a year and let my team handle everything else. And it's so rare to hear a lot of leaders say that. So for you, has that ever backfired against you? Have you ever um, has that ever gone wrong for you where you focus on one thing, but you needed to know something else and you didn't?
Uh, Jacob, I don't think so. I mean, I consider myself a humble person, and I consider our culture here a strong collaboration culture. So the problem is when you're not humble, when you don't know how to collaborate, then you have a problem in moments like you just mentioned.
Yeah.
But in my case, no. I mean, if I mean, let me just get the example of you. I mean, I reached you because I said, okay, I need to have some knowledge here, some ideas, and I'm not ready for it. and my CHRO is not ready for it as well. So who can help me? And I call, right? And I learn. Like I mean, let me give you an example of focusing. This last 6 months has been about people.
Okay.
So, and people who are listening this, I'm not doing I'm not doing propaganda for Jacob here, but I went to your
No, it's
platform,
okay. It's okay.
subscribe it.
We can do propaganda for Jacob. That's all right. We like that on this show.
I went to your platform, I subscribe it, I read all your texts, I hear all your daily videos that you send in a specific product that you have. That's it. That's how I handle when I need something. I call or reach people that can help me because I didn't prepare for some specific things.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting. And by the way, for everybody listening, wondering what that is on Substack. So you can go to greatleadership.substack.com and we will give a percentage of all the proceeds to Diego for selling the. So I love that approach. So if we could break that down into a framework for leaders, because I really think this lifelong learning framework is important. So if we were to break it down into steps, step one is pick a topic. And I guess it could be any topic, whether it's something like artificial intelligence or maybe something like, I don't know, empathy. And so you kind of take out a piece of paper or a notebook, you pick what the topic is, and then you also mentioned a couple questions that you ask, right? So what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my business? And then you do a little bit of research. You find, maybe you write down some people that you need to learn from or some books. And then what? Then you just start reading the books. Like, do you have follow-up from that? Do you put down what you learn? Like, what's the next step after you do the reading?
So I start to read the books. And then I start to get more dense, more specific books about the topic. I start to learn about people while I'm reading. So let me give the example that I mentioned of AI. I knew Ethan Mollick, professor of Wharton. That's where I got this guy.
Okay.
So I discovered that he is not only a professor, but also he has a newsletter on Substack. I said, that's great. So I started to follow him. So at a certain point, Ethan wrote a book, and I discovered because I'm following him. So I bought the book, I read the book. So it becomes a virtual cycle where you are inside of it, right? And then I go to X, to Twitter. So I go there and I only follow people regarding the topic that I'm specializing here. So I started to meet like 5, 10, 15 people that are like amazing in 6 months. I mean, you are in a level of knowledge that is very
Yeah.
interesting.
But how do you know when it's time to stop? Like, do you literally have a
Six
calendar?
months.
Yeah, but do you like literally on the 6 month, you're like, done, next topic?
Yes. It doesn't mean that I don't continue to learn, right? So, for example, Ethan Malek, I still a subscriber. I'm still getting his newsletter. So every like 2 weeks I read, and that's fine. But I'm not reading like 5, 10 books.
Okay.
I'm reading 1 or 2 newsletters. So that's the second buck of the 30-40% of the time.
Okay. And then so after you do this reading and connect with these people, do you do some sort of follow-ups with your team? Do you do like notes that you review? Do you do summaries? Do you know, like after the 6 months, what do you do with all that information?
I don't do anything like specific, but what I feel, Jacob, is that when the topic is demanded because competition is here or there, a dynamic change, the context changes, I'm ready.
Hmm.
I'm ready. I speed up like a bull,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, I know exactly what to do, who I need to call, what is the concept, how to structure, what to change. So I speed up very fast.
Yeah, that's so you notice a kind of a change in your it's like you upgraded software. It's almost like watching the movie The Matrix where Neo gets plugged in and then he says I know kung fu. So you kind of feel like that a little bit.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly,
All right.
exactly. For example, see how it's interesting. When the pandemic came 6 years ago, before the pandemic, 6 years before the pandemic, I took 6 months to study crisis, not corporate crisis in countries like
Hmm.
wars, like the bubonic, the or other problems such as the pandemics happening in 2020, and so on and so forth. So when the pandemic came to Brazil, of course, I'm not a specialist. Of course, I didn't know exactly what to do, but I have some like frameworks on my mind
Yeah.
that was crystal clear about how to react. I'm not saying that I did everything right. I'm just saying that I was much more prepared than other people regarding this topic.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up. How do you get this mindset into your leaders? So you're obviously a big believer in lifelong and perpetual learning, but it's also important for your leaders to believe in this as well. Do you have leaders who say, that's great you're doing that, Diego, I don't have time. Or like, I'm good, I don't need to do any of that stuff. How do you have those debates and dialogues with your other team members?
So I do three things. The first one, I try to get these people, the ones that don't like this, I try to get them out of the company in the hiring process.
Okay.
So I have people here out of the 30 people that I mentioned that is quite close to our culture, very close to our culture. They are the ones who say yes or no to get in the company, right? They are the final call of the hiring process. It's not the manager responsible for the position. It's these guys and girls that are responsible to say this person is part of our team. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I study a lot and I bring them together. So this November, myself with another 60 people are going to Stanford to spend a week working, studying at Stanford.
Wow.
So we built a program, everybody goes and spend a week there. Every year we do something like this. So every year, everybody in the company knows how study is important. And the third thing, I share a lot the dynamics. So I'm here in an all face with everybody. People, today I studied this, I studied that, I recommend this book. Every time that we have group meetings, I give books. I just bought 600 books that I'm giving to people next week.
Wow.
So it's again, this goes back to the simple communication frequency, like books, books. Doesn't matter the book. Stanford, China. It's simple. People get it.
Yeah, you got to make it a part of the process, which is, I think, important.
Yep.
Which I love. And now that we're out of time, Diego, why don't you let people know where can they go to learn more about you and iFood? I know you're on LinkedIn. I think you have like 125,000 followers on there. You're on X. Yeah. Where can people go to learn more?
Well, so I wrote 2 books. One of them is in English. It's a bestseller in Brazil. It's about the Brazilian new economy. So that's a place. The second one is being translated to English now. It's called The Scientist and the Executive. It's about the journey of iFood becoming an AI powerhouse here in Brazil. So that's 2 places to go. It's on Amazon and so on and so forth. You can buy there. The second thing is Diego Barreto. It's very easy to find a guy like me with this beard, black, becoming white. On LinkedIn and Instagram, I'm there. On Twitter, I'm not. I'm just like there to actually to get knowledge from people.
Next up, we have Jeff Kindler. He is the former CEO of Pfizer. And in this episode, he is going to talk about the importance of positive friction and why this is so important to drive better decisions and results. And he, again, you should look him up. He's on LinkedIn. The stories that Jeff talked about in our full episode, which you can easily find, just look up Jeff Kindler, Jacob Morgan. He's got some crazy stories. I felt like you could easily make a TV show about some of the things that he had to experience and go through. Articles have been written about him. Case studies have been written about him and his time at Pfizer. And you can Google and find all this sort of stuff. But the idea of positive friction, I think, is a very interesting one. And he also had this concept of a red team. And a red team is basically a team around you that's always there to challenge your thinking, to push you, to question you, to even disagree with you at times. So in this episode, Jeff Kindler is going to talk about the importance of positive friction and how that was such an important asset during his time as the CEO of Pfizer. There are a few things here that I wanted to go over. One was your idea of positive friction, and why that's so important. Today, especially inside of organizations, I feel like the idea of friction is frowned upon and we're trying to remove it. And we don't want people to disagree. We don't want people to debate. We want to create these overly safe spaces. We want psychological safety. We want, and I also don't view that as being healthy. And, there's Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And in it, he talks about that there's nothing about showing up to work that says you have a right to not be offended. The right is that you can be offended, but we can just do it in a respectful way.
Right.
But there's nothing in there that says you should never be offended. You should never disagree. You should do these things, but there's a right way and a wrong way to do it, to approach it and to do it. So what is positive friction? Why is it so important for leaders and for organizations? And do you have any tips or suggestions on how to do it the right way?
Yeah. Well, let me first start by agreeing with everything you just said. And I want to, as a little bit of background to this, let me contrast GE and McDonald's just as a starting point. GE, there was a lot of conflict. I mean, there was, in a good way, there was open, vigorous debate, and Jack encouraged that. Generally speaking, I wouldn't necessarily avoid letting him win the argument, but the culture was one in which people were encouraged to debate and speak up. When I went to McDonald's, and McDonald's is a wonderful company, and I had a wonderful time there, and I'm not saying this, I don't mean this to sound negative, but I would say that at least the way I experienced it, it was a Midwestern company. It was a company in which the executives, to their credit, were people who had oftentimes come up from the crew and so forth. And you would often be in meetings in which everybody seemed very nice and very agreeable, and there wasn't a lot of conflict. But you'd find out later that the conflict was happening. It was just happening in a passive-aggressive way.
Yeah.
So I think conflict is very important. Now, conflict can also get adversarial. It can get personal. That's not good. So positive friction is something that, I think about in the following way. The Pentagon has a thing they do called red teaming. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
What they will do is, if they're thinking about a particular course of action, and there's a famous example of this when George Bush was being asked to bomb someplace. I don't remember the specifics, but they make sure that they convene a group of people, they call the red team, whose entire job it is to come up with a counter argument to whatever it is that they're planning to do, to make sure that the arguments are really well presented. I have a particular interest in this because I grew up as a lawyer. I grew up as a trial lawyer. And the legal system is based on the whole idea that an adversarial clash of information will produce the best possible outcome. In theory, in the ideal scenario, you have two lawyers representing two sides being really strong advocates for their positions, and that hopefully produces the best possible outcome. I see this in corporate America all the time, where, for example, a CEO will present a deal they want to do, a merger or something, and the CEO has all the investment bankers and the consultants and the lawyers and the accountants lined up, and you basically, naturally, it's human nature, you get the argument for why that's the best course of action. I think it's really important to systematically, whether you're a leader, a manager, a member of a board, whatever it may be, find a systematic way to ensure that the other sides of the argument are heard, even if you have to be a little bit artificial about it, because only then will you make sure you make the best possible decisions. Do it positively, do it constructively, but friction actually can produce better outcomes, better information, better judgments. I'm a big believer in it. And by the way, you have to work to do it, because when you're the CEO, for example, people are naturally, tend to want to agree with you. If you're not careful, you're going to be surrounded by yes people and sycophants, and you're always going to hear what they think you want to hear. So you actually have to take affirmative steps to make sure you get counter arguments into into the discussion.
So how do you implement kind of a positive friction approach? Because and I agree with everything that you're saying. I guess the challenge that some people have is how do you move from an environment where you have friction, but it's negative, it's antagonistic, people are attacking you personally instead of the issue. How do you move from that to that positive friction approach? Are there any steps or strategies that you can take?
Well, I'll give you an example. Let's use the example I mentioned a moment ago, where a CEO is presenting a proposal for a deal. I think it's really valuable if he or she actually charges a specific group of people with the task of arguing the other side. Whether they actually believe it or they don't believe it, that's your job. Your job is to tell me why I'm wrong. So I'm giving you permission to challenge me. You don't have to, you're not taking any risks. It's not personal. It's your job. It's your assignment. That's what the red team concept is meant to be. And if you can institutionalize that in the boardroom, in the management meeting, whatever the context, and you just take the personalities and the emotions out of it. These are just about the facts. We're about to embark on a decision, or I'm thinking of going a certain direction. I want somebody to draw out the counter arguments. What you'll discover is there are things you didn't think about, there are perspectives you didn't have, and there may even be people in the room who had thoughts about it that weren't expressing it because they didn't have a vehicle for doing it.
Yeah.
I think that's just so important in leadership, to make sure you're hearing the other side. I think it's probably true of politics too, because I think we probably have some political elected officials that sometimes are only hearing from people that think they want to hear what they're saying. So I think it's good for people in general to hear it. It's even good at home. It's even good at home.
Yeah. So creating a red team seems like a good approach. Are there any guidelines for what makes an effective red team? I mean, how many people, like what? Because somebody might be listening and watching this thinking, okay, I want to put together a red team. What criteria?
Well, it all depends on, first of all, let me start by saying not every single issue or every single discussion warrants this. You should only do it when it matters. And by the way, when I talk to CEOs and counsel them, one of the things I tell them is it's just so important to figure out the 2 or 3 things that really matter, because it turns out this is one of the things that Jack was really good at. I don't know. I think I might have stolen this idea from Warren Buffett. So credit if it was his idea. But what I tell CEOs is make a list of the 10 things that you want to get accomplished this year, and then cross out the bottom 7. Because you're going to discover that if you really put the filter of what's really important to the enterprise and what is something that only I can do, that can't be delegated. Because if you are not delegating it, and it can be delegated, then either you're a micromanager or you have the wrong people.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would say on this whole subject is really stick to the things that matter, that are really material. The rest, 70% of the day is blocking and tackling. The decisions are straightforward. Someone else can make them. But for the things that really make a difference, then second thing I'd say is create a template, create a structure, so that both sides, again, if I could borrow from the legal system, for example, both sides are playing from the same rules. The briefs have to address certain things. You have to know what the facts are, what the law, the rules. So I would say, okay, we're going to make a decision. Here are the 5 things that really matter to making that decision. I actually had a meeting this morning on something very similar to this, if I can use the example. In my pain therapy company, we're evaluating the different drugs that we're developing because we're really trying to, the opioid crisis is a horrible thing, and there are not a lot of good treatments for pain, and a third of Americans actually suffer from undertreated chronic pain. So we have a whole bunch of different programs, but we have limited resources. So we have to make the decision, okay, which ones are we going to invest in, which ones we aren't? Well, what I've discovered, or what I knew and what I've seen, is that people start to get emotional about it. If it's my program, or if I have a particular interest in this one, we'll have a discussion, and it won't be, it will get personal, it will get emotional, and it won't be data driven. So what I said is, let's first agree, what are the 4 or 5 things that really are going to matter as to whether or not we develop this program? And what those 4 or 5 things are essentially is what's going to create the most value for our shareholders. And
Yeah.
there's a kind of a formula for that. So we put together a template. We say for every program, these are the 5 questions we want to ask. And the people that think we should do it, lay out your case. And the people that think we shouldn't do it, lay out your case. So we're at least singing from the same hymn book, if you will. We're speaking the same language. The vocabulary is matching up. So it's not like you're, speaking Greek and I'm speaking Latin. We're speaking the same language and we're understanding each other. And then have it out and make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to say their piece. And if a consensus emerges, great. But a consensus doesn't mean it's the right decision. Sometimes you just have to make a decision. But at least everybody's been heard and you've heard all sides and you get positive friction.
I heard another similar technique. I can't remember where I heard it from, but somebody was saying that if you're trying to decide if you should take on a certain project or if you want to say yes to something, you kind of evaluate it on a scale of 1 to 10. Do I want to do this, yes or no? And to cheat, a lot of people will usually put like a 7. And so the hack is basically like, if it's 8, 9, 10, you do it. If it's 7 and below, you get rid of it. So you can't kind of cheat there. And so that kind of reminded me of the, make a list of your 10 priorities and get rid of the bottom 7, I think you said.
One of the amazing things you find is, so I do this with every CEO I coach, and I say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to come up with this list of 10, reduce it to 3, and then I want either you or your assistant or whoever can look at your calendar. I 3 months from now, I want you to go back and I want you to see how you spend your time. And Jacob, it's amazing. Almost invariably, they spend 70-80% of their time on something other than the 3 things they said was most important. So I think the single most important skill you can develop in these jobs is time management.
Yeah.
Your time is such a precious resource, and if you actually examine how you're spending it, especially when you become a CEO, you're getting sucked into everybody else's agenda except your own. So you got to be ruthless about it. And if at the end of 3 months you find you're spending 80% of your time on something else, then maybe maybe those are the things you want to look at what you're actually doing as opposed to what you say you're going to do. It's remarkable how people suddenly discover what their priorities are.
And even you can even take it one step further and say time versus energy management, because I know there are lots of people who they might spend a lot of time doing something, but by the end they get a lot of energy out of it.
Yes.
For example, if you're like in your case, maybe you get a lot of energy when you're in the courtroom, but then you might spend just a little bit of time going through documents and you're like, that's boring and it drains my energy. So I think one of the things that a lot of leaders forget is the balance between time and energy. You might spend a little bit of time doing something and it zaps your energy, whereas you spend a lot of time doing something you actually enjoy, but when you're done, you actually get energy from it. And I think a lot of people
a great point.
Struggle with that.
A corollary of that, I think, is, and you're familiar with the basic concept that if you think of the employee population as kind of 20 low performers, 20 high performers, and then 60 in between, it's so true that because we're all high achievers, because we think we can influence people, you end up spending your time trying to help the bottom group improve, which is to your point, it's incredibly energy depleting. Whereas working with the high performers is not only energy creating, it's much more impactful on the 60% who are watching who you're spending the time with. Yeah. So I think it's a great point about energy.
Well, I feel like we could keep talking for hours and hours and hours, but we went over a lot of really cool stuff. Maybe before we wrap up, we can end on one more thing. Are there any stories that come to mind during the course of your career, whether with Jack or at Pfizer or with Jamie Dimon, any really profound stories or moments from working with so many other leaders out there that you think shaped who you are as a leader, or just any interesting stories?
Oh, interesting stories. I mean, I think the most interesting stories probably come from my days representing the National Enquirer, when I was a young lawyer who didn't know what he was doing and was sent into this big newsroom filled with really aggressive reporters, and I walk in with my suit and my little briefcase and this little office in the middle of this gigantic place with a little sticker on the wall that says lawyer, and people are coming in just like I said earlier, we got Elizabeth Taylor, or we got Liberace, or we got this guy or that guy, and can you approve the story or not? And it was pretty amazing stuff. and a lot of fun. And as I said earlier, it really helped me think about, how to make decisions quickly. I think one of the things that I most admire about great leaders, and what I try to learn myself, and I did learn at GE, was you never have enough information. This is one of the reasons why it's a huge transition from going from being a lawyer to being a business leader, because lawyers, they'll research thing as long as they can. As a leader, you have to make decisions on very, very short notice.
Yeah.
But being in the courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, and being able to tell Welch that we beat the rap on the price fixing case with De Beers was certainly a highlight of my life. I had, I've just had a lot of fun doing a lot of cool things and enjoying myself along the way and learning.
If you haven't heard yet, I just launched Future of Work Leaders, a global community of the world's top people leaders shaping the future of work and employee experience. If you are interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. Again, that is futureofworkleaders.com. Lastly, we have Frederic Laloux. And you will remember Frederic because he wrote this very mega best-selling book called Reinventing Organizations many, many years ago. And I thought it was really, really interesting to catch up with him because I can't remember when the book came out, but I think it's been 15 years, if not more. And he had this concept of teal organizations that, at the time, holacracy was a term that was being thrown around a lot, which you might be familiar with. And so in this episode, we're talking about this idea of self-management in organizations. This is a concept that hasn't been talked about, I think, for years, but I think it's still very interesting to explore and to talk about. And we really go into this idea of how to move away from command and control to what he calls a sense and respond approach. We'll also talk about a couple examples of companies that have implemented some of his strategies successfully, transitioning to self-management. And then we'll look at what worked and what didn't. And then you can decide if it's something that makes sense for your company. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Frederic Laloux as we talk about this idea of self-management and reinventing organizations. So let's talk about where to begin. So I don't know, I guess there are a couple of different angles we could look at. I don't know if we want to go through kind of like a checklist or, before we even go through the checklist, maybe it's taking a step back in high level, how to identify if you think you even need to change. So let's say a company is getting introduced to some of these concepts and ideas and they're thinking about, okay, what do I do? Obviously buy the book, look at the video series. But is there anything practical and tactical that people can do just after listening to this that you recommend?
Actually, I don't. I like the question because it allows me to say that I don't believe in the checklist thing or the tactical thing. What we're talking about here is not introducing one specific new management practice where you say let's, bring in team bonuses, to foster collaboration,
Yep.
right? Or let's create this one new leadership, program that advocates this one particular trait. What we're talking about here is sort of a wholesale change of, going from one coherent, management, structure and practice to another one. And so really, I think the best advice I could give is sit with it. Right. Through my book, in my book, I talk about some of these other organizations. There's some books that have been published about them. Go read about them, find out, see what it does with you, see where it resonates. Maybe you go self-management, I'm not ready for it, but I'm ready to reduce the numbers of management levels.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's different. Maybe you're actually that makes total sense for me. Let's try it out. Let's pilot it in some corner of the organization. Right. Maybe you go that's not the part that interests me, but the part about, when I talk evolutionary purpose of, moving from predict and control all of these, static budget incentive systems to something that is much more sense and respond, where we're much, much more agile. That is what I'm excited about. That's what my organization needs. And so let me find out more about that and let's trial that thing.
Yeah.
So my invitation would be really to just, sit with it, like let it infuse on you, see what of that works with you, and then start talking with colleagues and see what they get attracted to.
So if we did think about it kind of from a strategic angle, are there some strategy steps that people could take? So for example, number one, kind of like you said, get familiar with the concept, sit with it. Let's say people do that and they say, okay, great, we're on board, we like it. What are kind of some steps that you could put into place for strategy? Is it, do you first put together a team? Do you first kind of like define what you want this to look like? Like what, maybe those high level steps would be helpful.
Yeah. So clearly the most powerful thing is to get traction and invite other people who are excited by that to join you, right? Like if you as the leader of your business unit or as the CEO decide like, I'm excited by this and I'm just gonna roll it out, and everybody else goes like, what just happened to that person? And like, that's completely crazy, right? And the worst thing you can do is like, now give this a name, a program, this program a name, this is the Project Apollo, and we're now all going to be self-managing, and then people go like, so the best thing I think you can do is to get as much traction as you can with this, and there's some great ways to go about it. Like I know this, I'm thinking of a number of, like in Spain, there's this group, they have supported 60 manufacturing companies, many of them that were at the brink of bankruptcy. That's often when they get contacted, and to help them move towards these kind of models where they, create these self-managing teams in factories. And, they have found a sort of a replicable model to do that, to gain traction. So what they do is they work with the owners of these companies and expose them to this model, and are you sure that this is really what you want? And if you want that, then they go and do a whole company meeting. These are often smaller organizations, 100, 200, 300 people in factory, and expose this model, give examples of previous companies who've gone down that route, were in bankruptcy and have really recovered beautifully, and say, this is how these kind of things work. And we give you much, much more power because we believe that you actually know how to improve the product and lower costs and innovate. But it's up to you guys to decide. And then they often arrange a company visit where these workers, they close the whole factory for a day. They put everybody in buses, go and visit another company that has gone through that. And the management and these consultants step out. They're not in the room. You can ask any questions to these, to these people, and then they come back. They do another Q&A session, and at the end, they do a vote and say, are you guys ready for this, right? And generally, and they say that they only start in this case if the winning margin is 80%. Anything below 80% of people saying yes, they don't go there. So this is one particular model that works in these, industries with almost bankrupt companies where people then are excited to do this. So that's a model of involving lots of people. I've seen other examples where a CEO simply engages their leadership team, or sometimes they're like top 50, and do a 2-day retreat. And go like, you know what, I've been exposed to some of these ideas, and then they share from a very deep personal place, like, this is why this makes sense to me, but this is a huge adventure. Like, I wouldn't do this unless many of you think that this is the way to go, and then you facilitate great sessions. One way I've seen that I thought was so beautiful was so the CEO shares why they feel drawn to this, and often in a very personal way, where they say, like, I remember this one CEO saying, I rose through the ranks. Like, I was one person at the very bottom in the retail store, and I made it to the top. And it just hurts me that is no longer possible today. We've just stratified things so much, and we used to have so much power, and we were so innovative and creative in the stores. And it just pains me. And he just spoke from the heart, right? And he said, like, I want to go back to a model where we just empower people to, but I don't know how to do it, right? And what they did is they then went to some really beautiful deep place where they asked people, what are the deepest assumptions that characterize our organization today, right? And they had people think about it for themselves, then share it in pairs of twos, then share it around, right? And at some point they had a microphone go around and they captured on like this big whiteboard all of the ugly assumptions. Like in this organization, if you're not an engineer, no one listens to you, right? And so these kind of and so they had just had sort of like sort of this is the deep unspoken principles behind our organization today. And then they did another round of like if we could redesign this, what would be some of the principles, right? And so after these 2 days, like the whole top management team felt energized to try out something different, right? And that's when then you can actually go start do some of these changes. But then you can start to be quite radical and go like, in our case, it's the budget cycle that we just have to invent something better because this is not working, right?
Yeah.
Or we want to try out small self-managing teams in the factory, or whatever it is.
Okay. So it seems like kind of the first step, if I were to summarize, is you explore the idea and then you get buy-in, kind of share the concepts. So then what? Let's say you do get buy-in, you do share the concepts, ideas, people are on board.
Yeah.
Then what?
Then you do one thing after the other. And this is one, there's so much unlearning and relearning that you need to do when you go through these things. So I've been trained, as a McKinsey consultant in a thing where we thought that we were clever enough that in these complex organizations, we could map out a change program for the next 2 years.
Yeah, which is what most companies do.
Right. And we would make that whole thing. And of course, nothing ever goes according to plan, but we still had sort of this hubris, right? And one day, one of these organizations uses this simple metaphor to explain the difference between a complicated system and a complex system. And I had heard these words before, and it just felt to me like some abstract bullshit. But they explain it in a beautiful way that stuck with me, where they say, a complicated system is like an airplane, right? A Boeing or an Airbus, right? It has hundreds of thousands of parts in there, but they all respond in predictable way, in linear fashion, right? If you, Jacob, at random pick out one piece of the Boeing, like an engineer will be exactly able to tell you whether that thing still flies, how it will fly, what will change, right? It's predictable, it's linear. 100,000 of pieces, super complicated, but it's complicated. A complex system is a bowl of spaghetti, right? A bowl of spaghetti, I don't know, has maybe 40 parts, right? 40 spaghettis in there. But if you start pulling at one strand of the spaghetti, that sticks out, no supercomputer in the world can tell you what will happen. Will that spaghetti come out? Will it create a small knot? Will it entangle the whole thing? No one knows. That's a complex system, right? And so my old McKinsey thinking, right, considers organizations to be Boeings or Airbuses, to be complicated systems. And so we think that we can map out this change program for the next 2 years, right? And it feels very compelling. It feels very like, this thing, we can all map it out. I can foresee everything. I can make a beautiful, perfect plan.
Yeah.
The reality is that in most situations, not all, smaller units, that could work very well. But in most situations, we face complex systems, more like the spaghetti. And so what I can do is I can map out the first and the second step, maybe the third, right? I can basically, the analogy is I can start pulling on that spaghetti, and I pull and I watch and suddenly I go like, oh, let me stop here. Now something else opened up. Now let me pull at that spaghetti. And now something else opened up. And right, so the best you can do in these complex change programs is to foresee the first or second step, right? Something I was sharing, like, where is the pain today? Where is the energy at?
Yeah.
You know what? There's deep mistrust in the organization. So you know what? We'll actually work on trust levels. And for that, we will need to do these and that changes, right? We will need to create transparency on our results, right? That's the first step.
Okay.
And actually, the second step is maybe we'll change our investment process because people are tired of not understanding why this one unit gets money, not this other, right? And that's all I can plan for now. Because as I do this, new things will emerge, pain that I hadn't seen, or possibilities and suddenly, whoa, there's an acceleration. I can put in place the third chain and this fourth change, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that approach. So I guess it requires, I don't know, giving up a little bit of control in some sense, because you can plan things out for several years. So you kind of start small, and it's, one of the things that I always talk about is this idea of paying attention to the signs. So you start small and you pay attention to the impact that it has. If you have good results, you keep going in that direction. If you have negative pushback, you kind of stop, see what the problem is. If you can address it, then go forward. If not, maybe you need to take a step back. So I don't know what you call that. It's, I don't know if there's like a name for that approach, but
there's actually a word for that, is, going from predict and control to sense and respond.
Sense and respond. Yeah, I like that. Predict and control to sense and respond. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of companies are not good at that. A lot of leaders are very scared of that, the idea of sense and respond. It's because we're always taught predict and control. That's what the MBA programs teach. That's what companies teach. Contingency plans, playbooks. We want to have everything.
And again, that works well in a world that is complicated, in a world that is Boeing, right? And it served us really well. The problem is just our world has become too complex, right? And so we make these plans, but a month or two in, there's war in Ukraine, there's COVID,
ChatGPT,
there's something, right? And ChatGPT. And so suddenly, right? And so we need to be able to be much, much more agile and to be in a sense and respond, work in a sense and respond fashion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that approach. Is that your framework that you put together, sense and respond, or is that?
No, that's something that's been out there. Brian Robertson, the guy from Holacracy, does actually speak very beautifully about that. He has this beautiful metaphor where he says, imagine we would ride a bike in the way we run our organization, right? In predict and control. You would run a bike. That means you map out everything along the way until your destination. And it basically says, like, I'm going to start with an angle of, 47 degrees, and then I'm going to go for like 2.5 seconds. And then I'm going to move my angle, slightly, right? And I will foresee everything along the way, right? Yeah. And of course, that's not how we ride a bike. If that were to happen, like, there's a pothole that you hadn't seen, there's a car that's parked where you hadn't expected it, right? But in the organization, that what we do, we close our eyes and then, like, so that we don't deviate from plan, and then we try to ride, right? And he says, that's not how we ride a bike, right? In a really complex situation like riding a bike, we take in information from all our senses, and we constantly adjust. We have a very clear sense of where we go, but we constantly sense and respond, right? And so we actually now know how to do this. Like, instead of like this whole arsenal of traditional, 5-year planning, midterm budget, midterm planning, yearly budgets and incentives, like, we have different systems that, allow to do sense and respond. And it's just scary at first. So the limitation is not that we don't know how to do it. The limitation is, as you said, for a leader to go like, okay, I'm switching to sense and respond. I have a very clear sense of direction. But then, I don't exactly know what we'll do in 3 months or 6 months, because that thing is evolving, right? And if my board asks me, I won't be able to show them that beautiful plan, because that's no longer, how the world works.
Where can people go to learn more about you, your book, anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
Yeah, so there's obviously the book, Reinventing Organizations. It exists in 2 versions. There's the original text version, and then I created a shorter illustrated version that is very fun to read. I created that because at some point, some organizations like at Zappos, they ask everybody to read my book, and I was like, oh no, like, mandatory book reading. So I created this shorter illustrated version. So that might be a fun way to get into the ideas. If you're thinking about transitioning, then, the video series, thejourney.reinventingorganizations.com. And maybe people might be also interested in my latest project, which is called The Week. The website is theweek.oo. It's a project I created with my wife around the question of what is ours to do in the face of the climate emergency and more broadly sort of the environmental breakdown. Like, so many of us feel uneasy about the fact that we know that this thing is looming, feel that, this is an emergency, we should be doing a lot, but then, what do we really do? We feel small and feel powerless. I know so many business leaders whose children are marching for the future. I know, like, CEOs whose children are now ashamed to tell their friends that their father or their mother is a CEO of a company, because, and so so many of us live with that sort of cognitive dissonance. And The Week is a project to help us break through that thing and decide what is ours to do in the next, 5, 10, 20 years as I believe that this will be one of the big collective adventures for humanity, is to face this climate emergency. And one of the things is, instead of looking at it from a lens of fear and guilt and shame, as we so often do when it comes to climate or the environment, it's actually coming from a whole different lens of adventure and pride and joy and courage of like, wow, we have this collective human adventure that's going to start. I want to be able to tell my kids and grandkids, like, I was part of that. We did amazing things, and I was able to contribute all of these talents that I had, and it was just one of the best things I've done. So
thanks everyone for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. I hope you enjoyed this compilation of these 3 paid episodes that we released, and we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming very soon.